All right, so this is the second part of the chapter 5 DQ. You should have already done in order chapter 5 part 1 DQ as well as the chapter 5 close reading, and now this is the end of chapter 5. So there's a realization about the dream plan between Candy and George. So at this point, Lenny has taken off because he not only killed his puppy, but he also, on accident, I guess you could say, killed Curly's wife, shook her and snapped her neck. And at this point, George and Candy have come in and discovered her, and they know that Lenny did it. So we are on 46. Candy goes out and gets George, and we'll just start right here. George said, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife, and George stared. "Well, what's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. Oh, Jesus Christ. He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was as hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any idea?" he asked, and Candy was silent. "I should have knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Candy asked, "Well, what are we going to do now, George? What are we going to do now?" George was a long time in answering. "I guess we got to tell the guys. I guess we got to get him and lock him up. We can't let him get away. Why, the poor bastard will starve." And he tried to reassure himself. "Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him." But Candy said excitedly, "We ought to let him get away. You don't know that, Curly. Curly gonna want to get him lynched. Curly will get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last. "That's right. Curly will, and the other guys will." And he looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke his greatest fear. "You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much that I got to thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off?" Candy asked sulkily. George didn't answer his question, and George said, "I'll work my month, and I'll take my $50, and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house, or I'll sit in some pool room till everybody goes home, and then I'll come back and work another month and have another $50 more." Candy said, "Well, he's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do anything like this." So over here to number 1. George and Candy have a realization about their dream plan. What is the realization, and why is it important to their character development? So obviously, they know that it's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen without Lenny, and they have to do something to help Lenny because of what he's done. So that's the first part. But the second part is, why is it important to their character development? So how is this realization important to them as characters? Ooh, wrong thing. There we go. George still stared at Curly's wife. "Lenny never done it in meanness," he said. "All the time he done bad things, but he never done any of 'em mean." He straightened up and looked back at Candy. "Now you listen. We gotta tell the guys. They gotta bring him in, I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him," he said sharply. "I ain't gonna let him hurt Lenny. Now you listen. The guys might think that I was in on it. I'm gonna go to the bunkhouse, and then in a minute, you come out and you tell the guys about her, and I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that so the guys won't think I was in on it?" Candy said, "Well, sure, George. Sure, I'll do that." "Okay, give me a couple minutes, and then you come running out and tell like you just found her. I'm going now." George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. "You goddamn tramp," he said viciously. "You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you'd mess things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart. He sniveled and his voice shook. I could have hoed in the garden and washed the dishes for them guys. He paused, and then went on in a sing-song and repeated the old words. If there was a circus or a baseball game, we would have went to her. Just said to hell with work and went to her. Never asked nobody to say so. There'd have been a pig and chickens, and in the winter, little fat stove and the rain coming and just sitting there. His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson, and young Wit and Curly, and Crooks keeping back out of attention range. Candy came after them, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom, and they stopped and stood still and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her, felt her wrist, one lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. I know who done it, he cried. That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it. Why, everybody else was out there playing horseshoes. He worked himself into a fury. I'm gonna get him. I'm going for my shotgun. I'll kill that big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn, and Carlson said, I'll get my Luger. And he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. I guess Lenny done it all right, he said. Her neck's bust. Lenny could have did that. George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on. Maybe like that time in Weed that you was telling about. Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. Well, I guess we gotta go get him. Where do you think he might have went? It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south, he said. We come from the north, so he would have went south. Well, I guess we gotta get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Can't we maybe bring him in and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this to be mean. Slim nodded. We might, he said. If we could just keep Curly in, we might. But Curly's going to want to shoot him. Curly's mad about his hand. And suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't no good, George. I know, said George. I know. Carlson came running in. The bastard stole my Luger, he shouted. It ain't in my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. All right, you guys, he said. The nigger's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Wit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, You go in Soledad and get a cop. Get all the Wilts. Get Al Wilts. He's deputy sheriff. Let's go now. He turned suspiciously on George. And you're coming with us, fella. Yeah, said George. I'll come. But listen, Curly, the poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him? Curly cried. He got Carlson's Luger. Course we'll shoot him. George said weakly, Maybe Carlson lost his gun. And I seen it this morning, said Carlson. No, it's been took. Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife, and he said, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going, he said. I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big bastard myself, even if I only got one hand. I'm going to get him. Slim turned to Candy. Well, then you stay here with her then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George! You stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. George moved slowly after them, and his feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Poor bastard, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter. The barn was darkening gradually, and in their stalls, the horses shifted their feet and rattled their halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm. That's the end of chapter 5. So the second question is to describe the overall mood of the chapter, and then to tell me what scene from the chapter stands out most to you. So in the beginning, before we find out about the puppy, it seems pretty peaceful, just like a calm Sunday afternoon. And then you learn about the puppy. And honestly, that's more sad than dark, right? Because you know that Lenny didn't mean it, and it's just upsetting because Lenny's upset. And then Curly's wife comes in, they talk back and forth, we learn about her. Maybe you have some pity for her because of how ignorant she is, and also the fact that she's probably being abused by Curly. And then we have the scene where, they're talking about velvet and soft things, and Curly's wife says, "Oh, yeah, my hair's soft," and says to Lenny, "Go ahead and pet it." And then there's that really tense, really dramatic scene, undoubtedly the most dramatic scene in the entire book, where unfortunately, she screams, Lenny panics, puts his hand over her mouth, and his hands are so huge, his hand pretty much covers her entire face, and she can't breathe. And obviously, she starts struggling and hitting him. That makes him panic more until finally he gives her a good hard shake and her neck snaps. So that's definitely, tense and dramatic, definitely the climax of the book. And then you have the decline of that, where Candy comes in, George comes in, and then that's solemn and sad because they realize their plan's not going to come true. They realize that, Lenny's in big trouble. And then the men coming in and saying, "We're going to lynch him, we're going to shoot him." And obviously, the drama then builds again. And at the end, you're left with suspense, for one, but also the chapter pretty much ends how it started, with the mention of the horses in their stalls just kind of eating. Because it's meant to put it all into perspective for you that all this drama is happening between people, but animals don't care. They're just hanging out. And then of those key scenes, so there's about 4 scenes in that chapter, which one stands out to you the most? And just kind of explain why. And then number 3, why does George lie about where Lenny is hiding? What do the men want to do to Lenny? So they want to kill him, shoot him in the guts, use a quote. And why does he lie about where Lenny's hiding? Because we know where Lenny's hiding. Because in the very beginning, chapter 1, George said, "Lenny, if you ever get in trouble, come back here, like to the river and the brush by the river, and hide in the brush until I come for you." So he didn't go south. He went back to the river. So why did George lie about where Lenny's hiding? And that answer should be obvious to you. And then when you're done with this, please turn it in.